Hilton Parkway Gateway Corridor Independent Review Advisory Committee meeting of Wednesday, April 10th, 2024 to order. On the approval of minutes, I know that there was a correction that needs to be made to the minutes to add your name being in attendance, and this has been done, and a copy of the revised draft of minutes is before you. And are there any other corrections or amendments to be made? Okay, do I have a motion to approve the minutes as corrected? Order, Mr. Wozniak. All those in favor, please signify by raising your right hand. So moved. So we do have, just for the record, Mr. Avocat should be online with us. Thank you for joining us remotely. But unfinished business, let's go ahead and move on to the project work, the scope of work.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to turn it over to Nate and the Lockmuller team to go through, give us an update on project scope, and then continuation of the findings related to this initial portion of the project. And if the committee has questions, we'd love to hear them and be able to address them at today's meeting. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sean. Mayor Perry, members of the committee, thank you all once again for allowing us to meet with you. I know it's been a short turnaround time since we met a couple weeks ago, but we've been working pretty diligently and excited to share the information that we have for you. Before I do that, though, I did want to make sure and note who from the Lockmuller team is going to be joining us virtually. We have Kate Swinford, who you're all very familiar with. She's leading our technical components of the traffic engineering analyses and corridor study. And then we also have Michelle Romine joining us. She's one of our lead traffic engineers and has been assisting Kate throughout the duration of the project. And then we also have Lauren Jackson with us. He's our chief roadway engineer, and he's been helping us determine the right-of-way and roadway related impacts with each alternative. And then we also have Chad Costa. He's our environmental design engineer that is looking at it from the environmental perspective for each of the alternatives. So I wanted to thank them for joining us, and we have that subject matter expertise if and when questions do come up today for anything with that. Apologize. So for the agenda, as we typically do, I'll give you all an update on where the project stands to date. And then Kate will be going into the traffic operational findings for alternative 4. If you recall from last month's meeting, the traffic operating conditions for alternative 4 were not completed, but we're going to be sharing that with you today. And then we will allow Lauren and Chad respectively to speak to the right-of-way and roadway impacts that they've determined, as well as the environmental side of things. And then we'll conclude it by showing you the matrix that we put together that compares each of the 4 alternatives against one another based upon the criteria that was set forth in the town's request for qualifications. With regard to the scoring matrix, I did want to note that our team, we submitted this, the drafts slide deck on Friday. We've continued to refine that, and we feel from the environmental side of things particularly, there's a little bit more information as to what the community may have at this time. However, we're going to leave a copy of everything so that people have a copy of the full presentation at the end of the meeting. So what we've been working on over the past couple of weeks is just essentially what we're going to be presenting to you today is the findings for traffic findings for alternative 4, and then looking at those roadway, right-of-way, and environmental impacts for all 4 alternatives. From a progress standpoint, overall, I would say we're at that 50% mark, a little bit beyond that. Right now, we are at I'd say kind of the vertex point of task 3, and I'll detail what we have left to do here in just a moment. But that's really the middle of the project, and we're getting ready for the documentation. So kind of on a downhill run now. From a task perspective, or the subtask perspective, task 1, I would estimate we're about 75% complete. As I noted at the last meeting, and have recurringly, we're going to continue to have meetings with you all. But specifically, the key deliverables that I noted last time with the brief technical memorandum with some of the topics shown in the bullet point, as well as the seismic evaluation with the retrofit versus rehab. We anticipate to have both of those deliverables to you for discussion prior to the next month's committee meeting. I will note that we're still waiting on the Department of Transportation to get us a copy of that seismic study, but we're continuing to effort to get that from them. Task 2, as I mentioned at the last meeting, that is 100% complete. That was the review of the existing conditions and the travel demand model. Task 3, that includes the intersections along 278 and William Hilton Parkway from within Bluffton, from Buckingham Plantation and Moss Creek, eastward to the Cross Island Parkway and then to Gumtree Road. And we've completed all of our preliminary analyses, and we are in the process now of putting that all into documentation form. The deliverable that was in the scope is to provide you all with a draft summary of findings memo for task 3. That takes everything from the initiation of the project to through completion of task 3. We will be having that to you planned for prior to the May 8th committee meeting. And then following that, we'll have received comments from you all with an anticipation of having a presentation to council during a workshop at a date to be determined in June. Task 4, that's taking into consideration the intersections downstream of the Cross Island Parkway. And it's our intent that following the meeting today is that we're going to begin in earnest developing the modeling associated with those remaining intersections. And based upon the feedback received from the preliminary matrix, we're going to be presenting choosing the alternatives to be evaluated within that software modeling. And then task 5 is, as I mentioned before, that's just the final task where we're putting everything into a final traffic safety and operations report. And that'll be a presentation as well to City Council, the team of council when we're completed with that. So that gives an update on where we stand. Before I hand it over to Kate, did anybody have any questions regarding the status of the project?
Excuse me, at this time, have any questions or comments? Okay, thank you.
We'll move on to Kate. We'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Sure, thank you. We'll start with a brief overview just to jog everybody's memory of what our 4 alternatives are that we are discussing here today. Our alternative 1 is the SCDOT modified recommended preferred alternative. Alternative 2 included bow ties, which are roundabouts on some side streets at Squire Pope and Spanish Wells. Alternative 3 includes either an echelon or center turn overpass configuration, which are grade separated intersections at either Squire Pope or Spanish Wells, not both. And alternative 4, is our version of an elevated bypass. And again, I will reiterate, these numbers are simply the order in which we analyzed these alternatives. They do not in any way, shape, or form indicate a preference or a grade assigned to them. That is just sequential numbering. Let's go to the next slide, Nate. We have some visual overviews, again, just to jog everybody's memory about what we are talking about when we discuss each of these alternatives. The SCDOT modified recommended preferred alternative should be very familiar to this group. It generally involves lane widening and at-grade intersection improvements throughout the length of the corridor. On the next slide, alternative number 2 shows a bow tie configuration at Squire Pope and Spanish Wells. This configuration would require vehicles to make a right-hand turn, travel through a roundabout, and then return in their intended direction of travel. It does not allow left turns at the major intersection. Alternative 3
on the major street, motorists
is either an echelon or a center turn overpass at either Spanish Wells or Squire Pope. We do not have the room along the corridor to have a grade separated intersection solution at both of these locations. And so there is some flexibility within alternative 3 as to which intersection could receive treatment and then which treatment even would be recommended. But generally this is, kind of a mid-step, if you will, between full grade separation and a, full interstate or interchange solution. Alternative 4 is our version of the elevated bypass. I know that we have talked a lot about the option to have a bypass in a number of these meetings, and we thought it was certainly a good idea and worth looking into. And our version of it aligns with the current roadway placement and does not forge a new alignment through any new right-of-way. So we showed a version of this in our last meeting on the last set of slides. This is the same information with just a little bit of updated shading on some of the intersections, hopefully making it easier to understand or digest what's really going on at each of these locations. And as you can see, as Nate kind of flips through the slides here, the elevated portion of the roadway is shown in the middle, 2 lanes in each direction. There is still a ground level roadway, an at-grade roadway, and access remains as it is today in a traditional configuration at all of the side streets, including Squire Pope and Spanish Wells. There is also the potential opportunity to have Old Wild Horse be a full access intersection instead of just a right in, right out. And as you continue down the slide deck, you should see the connection into the Cross Island Parkway into the existing flyover ramps. And with this configuration, if you have specific questions about how things will connect or where things will land or touch down, Lauren Jackson, our chief engineer, as Nate mentioned, is on the call with us today. He should be able to provide more specifics. But in general, this option would allow for eastbound traffic to bypass Squire Pope and Spanish Wells completely and connect to either the Cross Island Parkway or touch back down past Gumtree. Similarly, it would allow westbound traffic to bypass Gumtree, Spanish Wells, and Squire Pope and touch back down west of Squire Pope and really separate the vehicle paths and movements in some of the most congested areas of the corridor. And again, these, okay. So some of the pros and cons of the elevated bypass. Some of the pros is we believe it's going to improve safety as there will be fewer vehicles that remain at grade with those side street crossing intersections, which would reduce the number of conflicts between vehicles and pedestrians. It would reduce the number of vehicles that pedestrians would have to compete with to cross, to cross the roadway. It will increase the efficiency at the at-grade signalized intersections. Obviously, if we are removing a large portion of the through traffic, the side street operations will improve greatly. It should significantly reduce the size of the at-grade intersections. And by that, we mean that it will reduce the number of lanes required to be in place at the intersections that remain on the ground, in particular for the side street movements. Perhaps we will not need to widen side streets as much because they will not be competing for signal cycle time with a large number of through vehicles any longer. Those vehicles will be removed and on the bypass. And it would potentially provide for increased growth along the corridor or some breathing room, if you will, if that is desired into the future. Some of the cons of the elevated bypass, obviously it's going to be the most expensive alternative of the 4 that we are considering here today. And that is really due to the, the length and quantity of bridge structures that are required to elevate, such a large portion of the roadway. This will result in the largest construction impact. It requires the most grade separation, and it requires a change in decision-making as drivers look to go through the local intersections of Squire Pope or Old Wild Horse or Spanish Wells. And if they are looking to enter the bypass or not, it would be perhaps a few different turns for them to get into their intended direction of travel. But again, it shouldn't be rerouted necessarily. It would just look different than it is today as a traditional at-grade corridor. And as we note, full access will still be provided. They just, again, may have to travel a short distance to merge onto the bypass, depending on which direction they're intending to travel. Our next slide is similar to what we presented in our prior presentation for alternatives 1 through 3. And now we have our information finalized for alternative 4. So the at-grade intersections really, could be reduced in size and would be expected to operate well at an overall level of service C or better for Squire Pope, Spanish Wells, and Gumtree. And each of those 3 are certainly pain points on your existing system. Full access could be made available at Old Wild Horse, which is not a condition that's out there today. Overall, the study intersections are expected to operate acceptably under alternative 4. The signalized intersections throughout the corridor would operate again with a level of service C or better overall. Some of the unsignalized side street approaches may still experience some longer delays, but again, in the area where the bypass would be implemented, if we are separating out a majority of the through traffic, those delays would be greatly reduced, and they wouldn't be competing with as much traffic within the same space. So we did a similar travel time run comparison along the corridor between Moss Creek and Indigo Run, and as similar to what we showed in our prior slide deck for alternatives 1 through 4, we have a difference in travel time reported in seconds when compared to the 2045 no build condition. So in the AM, the morning peak, eastbound traffic would be expected to see at least a 19% reduction in total travel time. Westbound traffic would be expected to see, potentially a 43 or 44% reduction in travel time. It's also important to note that these travel times were performed in synchro, and we, as a next step in task 4, do have VISM modeling scheduled in our scope of work for one of these alternatives. And we would expect that those travel times would be either confirmed or potentially improved a little bit for alternative 4, should it be, one of the alternatives that, kind of graduates from this task into task 4 to be put into a VISM model. The next slide shows an overall travel time comparison of all the alternatives that we have analyzed. Again, the information for alternatives 1, 2, and 3 are not new. We showed them to you at our prior meeting on the 27th. Alternative 4 has now been slotted in at the bottom to complete the table. And as you can see, any of the alternatives are going to provide a range of approximately 15 to 20% reduction of travel time for the eastbound direction in the morning when compared to no build travel times. And in the PM for westbound travel times, we're ranging anywhere from 34 to approximately 44% in potential travel time reductions, depending on which alternative we're specifically looking at for traffic considerations. I'll pause there and ask if there are any questions about the traffic or the travel times, because the rest of the slide deck that I'm speaking to is going to be more related to pedestrian and bicycle connectivity and safety, and then we're going to get into right-of-way and environmental.
So at this time, does the committee have any questions or comments regarding the information provided? All right, thank you. Continue.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next slide gets into, it summarizes really the travel time information that we've presented thus far, and even attempts to quantify some of the side street operations in addition. The travel time along US 278, we did a ranking system, so I'll back up for just a little bit and try and explain our methodology for these rankings. We felt it was best to rank the alternatives against one another. We kind of indicated that we would be using this process at the end of our prior meeting on March 27th. And as instead of trying to do a, good versus bad rating, we really tried to rank them against one another to have it be as, objective as possible for each of these different considerations. So if you were to look back at the slide previously, Nate, you don't have to go there, but we use those numbers to compare against one another and opine as to how they relate to one another for the travel time along US 278. So in our opinion, alternatives 1 and 2 are very similar. The numbers are not exact in the table on the prior slide, but they are close enough that we feel that they would provide about the same level of relief or travel time improvement along the entire corridor. So we gave them a tie. We ranked them the same as, probably last on the list. And then the 2 other alternatives that have grade separated components, alternative 3 and 4, they performed a little bit better as far as travel time comparisons go. And that is certainly logical. When you have grade separated components as part of any configuration, you naturally are removing vehicle conflicts from the same path sharing the same space. So we certainly expected to see the grade separated alternatives provide a little bit, better level of service and reduced travel time along the corridor. So the elevated bypass is provides more grade separation and more opportunity for the separation between vehicles traveling through the corridor and the local traffic than alternative 3 does, which is why we gave it a higher score than alternative 3 comparatively. But we also understand that travel time along the corridor is not the only thing that is important to the community. There are certainly people that commute onto the island every day and then go home that care about the travel time, but there are certainly residents along the corridor, residents in any part of the island that still need to travel, travel through this system every day, and they might not necessarily just be doing the AM and PM commuter peak. So we also wanted to make sure to look at the overall intersection operations, including the side street operations. And when we did that, even in alternative 1, the modified SCDOT recommended preferred alternative, there are still some movements along the corridor that provide a level of service F, which would be technically failing, and that would be the northbound approach of Squire Pope in the PM. And additionally, alternative 3 also has some movements with a level of service F, and those would be the southbound approach at Squire Pope in the PM under the echelon configuration of Squire Pope, or if a center turn overpass were to be at Squire Pope, the northbound approach at Spanish Wells would be failing in the PM. And so because those 2 configurations had any failing levels of service on any approach, we decided that those would be, ranked lowest amongst the group in this particular category. Alternative 2, we really didn't have any movements that were failing. However, some of them had level of service E, which means it's at capacity. Theoretically, there's not any additional room for growth at that particular movement during that peak hour. And because alternative 2 had a few locations with level of service E, we therefore decided to rank it above alternative 1 and 3, but less than alternative 4, which did not have any locations with a level of service F or E for side street approaches. And so after considering all of the 3 subcategories, we totaled up their assigned scores and assigned an overall rank for this category being traffic and operations, and came to the conclusion that alternative 4, the elevated bypass, would provide the most benefit in this category, the highest reduction in delay, the highest reduction in travel time. Alternative 2 and 3 were, tied for next best. And then alternative 1 would be the alternative that provides the least amount of relief in the travel time area, again, specific to this one topic, which is traffic and operations. And as we move on to the next slide, we also consider bicycle and pedestrian impact. And, again, we have each of the alternatives shown in this table in the columns, and then some different considerations for each of them in the rows. And so when we think about pedestrian crossing distance, we believe that alternative 1 would provide the longest pedestrian crossing distance, which really is it's not a good thing. The longer a pedestrian has to be in the road until they reach, back a curb, back, in the right of way on a sidewalk in a protected space, that's just more time that they're exposed. And so we certainly look for alternatives that shorten the crossing distance when possible, or provide median refuge islands or those types of things when we look to compare these against one another. So alternative 1 will have the longest pedestrian crossing distances, and that is a function of the width of the road and the size of the intersections. Alternative 1 does not have any alternative configurations. It does not have any grade separation. All the movements are at the main intersection, and that is some wide lanes, some dual turn lanes, and requires pedestrians to navigate a pretty large distance to cross the road. The rest of the alternatives 2 through 4, have reduced pedestrian crossing distances and reduced exposure to motor vehicle traffic, but they generally, of those 3, we couldn't find much differentiation between the rest of them as far as pedestrian crossing distances go. We also look at potential to install median refuge islands, and there would not be that opportunity in alternative 1, the SCDOT recommended preferred modified alternative. But alternative 2, there is some potential for them. Alternative 3 also has some potential between the directional traffic flow to allow pedestrians to more comfortably navigate the complex intersection. And alternative 4 also will have the opportunity to provide refuge islands between directional traffic flow. However, it may require multiple refuge islands per leg, or they will have long end-to-end crossing distances, meaning they will, even though it's separated and they're, removed from that bypass traffic, which will be traveling above them, it still is a pretty long distance for them to be crossing. It will require multiple refuge islands, multiple stops. It's just it's essentially two systems they'd have to be crossing instead of just the one. So that was some slight, unfavorable recommendation for that alternative in that one particular area. We also looked at conflict points. Again, conflict points is a term related to where in an intersection can two moving vehicles or a pedestrian and a vehicle potentially collide and interact with one another. And theoretically and logically, the fewer number of conflict points that are even available in an intersection, that's going to reduce the likelihood and chances of people to be in conflict with one another. So for alternative 1, there are multiple turning movements and, a lot of potential for conflict points along each leg. And then if we get into some of the grade separated alternatives or the alternative intersection configurations with alternative 2, those would reduce some of the conflict points and vehicle turning movements, thereby providing a little bit more protection for some of the pedestrians. The next slide talks about safety impacts, more specifically as it relates to vehicles. And again, we were able to find conflict points for each of these alternatives to compare them against one another. A traditional intersection, I guess let me back up and clarify. These conflict points are per intersection. Okay, so it's not 32 conflict points over the entirety of the entire corridor, but generally a traditional intersection without an alternative or innovative configuration or without grade separation has 32 conflict points within it. So 32 possible crossings of vehicle paths where vehicles could potentially be in an accident with one another if they are occupying the same space. Alternative 2, when we look at a bow tie intersection configuration, the number of conflict points is reduced to 20, and a lot of that is due to the removal of left turns from the main intersection. Alternative 3, either an echelon or a center turn overpass, those alternatives respectively would have 22 or 24 conflict points. And then alternative 4, the bypass is not an intersection per se, so it was, not able to be quantified in those terms, but there are some crash modification factors available that indicate a reduction could be in the range of 30 to 50% for something like a bypass. And so, these are very high level estimations of safety impacts. We would certainly recommend a more in-depth analysis would be needed to verify the specific reduction number, if that is ever desired. I know, certain grant applications, for example, ask for that number. So there would still be more work to get a more granular value from this area of the table that we're considering. But at this point, we're comfortable comparing the alternatives against one another based on this information. All right, so are there any questions on the bicycle or pedestrian connectivity or safety? And if not, then I'm going to turn it over to Lauren Jackson, our chief roadway engineer, to discuss roadway impacts.
Question is that Warner. On 2 and 3, what if we were to look at, I don't know how you put a overhead pedestrian bike, but maybe underneath a tunnel, and that would allow the pedestrians, bikers to move at free will, not as the traffic is flowing. I don't know. I'm just thinking on top of my head. I haven't even gone back to look at your drawings if that would work, but alternate 4 is pretty easy for the pedestrian bikers. I was thinking 2, 3, some way to make it easy for them, and it eliminates the conflicts then.
Yeah, any we talk about I've talked about grade separation for vehicles quite a bit in our conversations over the past few months, but the same principles apply to pedestrians and bicyclists. If there was a way to do, or a desire to do, a pedestrian overpass or a tunnel, as you mentioned, it could go up or down. That would remove all of the conflict points because there is no opportunity for them to interact with the vehicle in that space. They are completely separated. That is not something that we considered at this point. We were trying to see how those facilities could be folded into and work in concert with a potential roadway improvement. But if there is desire or appetite to do some sort of separated structure for pedestrians and bicyclists, I would certainly, be a huge advocate for that. And that would be the safest option for people to cross, is if they had their own complete crossing that did not include any vehicle conflicts.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would also mention on that, as far as if you're doing a separate pedestrian facility, either under or over, that could be applied to any of the alternatives. So it really doesn't change the results of what each alternative provides. It would just be an added benefit if you could do it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Lauren. Thank you. All right, so hearing no other comments, Lauren, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. And I'm going to just kind of go through a little bit more detail on the right-of-way impacts that for the various alternatives. Starting off, and as we go through this, you can just go to the aerials showing each one. Alternative 1, which is basically the state option with some modifications. Those modifications do include an additional lane southbound at Gumtree. So we do have a right-of-way impact over there to add that additional lane. So that's where the right-of-way impact on this one's coming from. Otherwise, this is the footprint of this improvement is the same as the original state alternative. You go on to number 2. The bow ties, obviously what we've done there is we're adding some roundabouts on the side streets. So you can see we've got additional right-of-way needed there for those roundabouts. At the intersections, we're eliminating a left turn lane. So we're potentially gaining a little right-of-way there. But at this point, we didn't want to commit to a reduction in right-of-way, but it's very possible that there could be a slight reduction in right-of-way along Main Line on this alternative just because you don't need those turn lanes. And then this improvement does include the additional lane at Gumtree still. And that works out to roughly 1.1 acres total. The Gumtree right-of-way is about 0.2 acres. We go on to alternate 3. This is the echelons or center turn overpasses. And what we're showing here is basically the worst case for whatever options are chosen there, because there are multiple options within this alternative. So as you can see, we still have the improvement at Gumtree, and then we have a little bit of widening, additional right-of-way required along the Main Line. And that is to provide right turn lanes separating off from the raised section to provide access to the parcels adjacent to the intersections. And then we also have some right-of-way needed for some turnarounds to maintain full access. Because one of the issues with when you start raising grade at the intersections, you start impacting some of the local access near the intersection. So to address that, we're providing some additional lane or some turnarounds to be able to maintain full access. And then alternative 4, there are no additional right-of-way takings required. That completely fits within the footprint of the state option right-of-way.
Lauren, sorry, could you go back? I have a slide for the center turn overpass right-of-way. That's a little bit different than the echelon.
Oh, okay. I forgot that second one. Okay. Yeah, the center turn, again, it's similar to the echelon, slightly different just because of the configuration. You can see the right-of-way along the main line is slightly different locations. The turnarounds are similar. What we've done with this, because of the configuration at Spanish Wells, we are using the same layout with the roundabouts as the bow tie option, just because of the way the lanes worked out, doing the turnaround closer wasn't as advantageous. But otherwise, it's somewhat similar to the echelon options. And then here's our kind of summary of the right-of-way. As I mentioned, the alternative 1, the modified state option, has that 0.2 acres at Gumtree. And then option 2, the bow ties, is 1.1 acres for those roundabouts that are being added. And that would be on the local system. There is no additional right-of-way along the main line roadway there. And then alternative 3, we just looked at for either one. The worst case there is 1.4 additional acres, both on the side streets as well as a little bit along the main line. And then the elevated bypass has no additional right-of-way. That fits completely within the footprint of the state option or existing right-of-way. So as we go through the rankings there, you can see there's not a huge difference in the right-of-way amounts there. The quantities are fairly small, but we have ranked those in order there. And then we've also provided a ranking as far as our projected cost of each one of these alternatives. You can see the modified state alternative is projected to be the lowest cost. And that is because it is generally these costs are based on the state alternative. So it's basically the original alternative with some operational improvements that don't really have significant costs, plus the improvement at Gumtree of that additional lane. So it's slightly more than what the state alternative would be, but not much. So it ranks first. We've got the alternative 2. That does require adding those roundabouts. So that's going to be a little bit higher cost than alternative 1. And we get into alternate 3, which has the raised intersections. So obviously those will have some additional cost on top of that because you still have some of the turnarounds. And then alternative 4, the elevated bypass, would obviously be the most expensive because you'll have a combination of raised roadway on embankment with walls and then bridges at the crossovers.
Got
So as you
a quick question there. Are you able to tell us the percentage of difference between 1, 3, 4, and 3?
At this point, not. We will have that in the final report.
Okay.
We're still waiting for some more detailed information from the state on cost data.
Okay, thank you.
So as we totaled those up, like we did on the previous analysis, you've got the rankings there. The alternate 1 comes in first, followed by 2 and 4, and then alternate 3 has the 4th place ranking. Okay. Anybody have any questions on that?
Does not appear that we do.
Okay. With that, we'll move on to environmental then.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. All right. So for the environmental overview, the state's draft environmental assessment, or EA, you'll hear me use that acronym through sporadically throughout my portion of this presentation, but the state's EA does a good job at providing baseline resources, both ecological and social, within their defined project area. The intent of the environmental overview is to look beyond that area at a very high level to identify potential areas of concern, or what we call red flags, associated with the alternatives that are being discussed here for consideration. The intent is to inform design engineers, traffic engineers such as Lauren, Kate, and Nate of potential constraints and accommodations can be made into plan development, and for the project team to assess risk, being risk to how it affects overall cost and schedule. When evaluating several alternatives, such as we are doing here, as part of the well, we're not doing this as part of the NEPA process. The NEPA process is what the SCDOT is undertaking, but we're informing what would happen to that NEPA process for whatever alternatives we recommend to the town and town advances. But when evaluating several alternatives as part of an evaluation such as this is an acceptable method to do this high level GIS level review to screen down alternatives to a reasonable batch to advance for further consideration. And that high level screening is usually done because of the cost prohibitive nature of completing detailed field investigations and reporting on every alternative that an agency or municipality is looking at. The overview is limited in that the resources that we're talking about here today have not been field verified, again, only looked at from this 10,000 foot elevation. Public and stakeholders have not been engaged regarding any of these proposed alternatives yet. I believe that would be forthcoming for whatever alternatives are advanced and look to be adopted into the state's project. Input from resource agencies also haven't been gathered yet. So again, high level, looking at potential red flags and how that may impact the state's EA. But these types of inputs, the gathering of information from resource agencies, from the public, the stakeholders, and doing your detailed field investigations, that's all part of what should be coming later. But anyways, we'll jump into the next slide here. There's a couple of maps. The maps show our red flag resources associated with the four alternatives, generally associated with physical encroachments or, as Lauren said, additional right-of-way that's thought to be needed for each alternative. And hopefully you guys can see the legend from where you're at. I think you guys have the presentations in front of you, but alternative 3 is shown in yellow there. That's the additional right-of-way areas. Again, assuming worst case scenarios here. I know there's different variations for alternative 3, but that's worst case right-of-way. And then the orange strip there down by Gumtree, that's associated with alternatives 1, 2, and 3. That's the additional right-of-way needed there along Gumtree for the turn lane Lauren mentioned. And then alternative 2 is shown in red polygons there for the bow tie locations. So generally, these are areas of physical encroachment that would be added. The exception to this is alternative 4, which is shown in a magenta color here. That was added just for, we just wanted to make sure a footprint was delineated so that when we're doing our high level evaluation on resources, we didn't forget there was an elevated bypass lane that went through that Cross Island interchange there. So this map here generally shows the ecological. This is broken up into for ease of viewing because we don't want to put everything on one map. That'd be just too crazy. But for ease of viewing, we broke it up into ecological and cultural. So what you see on this map are largely your NWI wetlands. So that's National Wetland Inventory wetlands. And some people think NWI wetlands are actual physical delineated boundaries. They're not. They're just polygons that somebody drew on a map that said there is something of noteworthy consideration in this area. and then they label it. You see PEMs, PFOs, those are clustering emergent wetlands, clustering forested wetlands. You got a lot of estuarine, so saltwater wetlands in this area too. Those are your E classifications there. So these are just broad categories of wetland classifications that serve as a starting point, but then you have to go out and, like I said, field verify that they're actually present. We also have the floodplain map on here too. That's shown in a more of a bluish transparent layer there. Let's see. I think that's pretty much it on this. Nate, if you can go ahead and move forward. So here's our social resource map here. We, of course, all are familiar with Stony traditional cultural property. Because Alternative 4 does swing down towards Gumtree Road, we now have Squire Pope, which is another Gullah community that comes into focus here. You also have on the south side of south side of 278 and what would be the west side of Cross Island Parkway, Honeyhorn Plantation, which was identified as resource that was eligible for the national, or that is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. From the records that we've been able to obtain, that was identified at the time Cross Island Parkway was being constructed, and my best I can pinpoint when that occurs, sometime between 94 and 2005, according to historic aerial photography. But we can, let's see what else we have. We have Jarvis Park here. It's off to the edge of the screen in green. And then several pathways, I think, are added on here. And then there's Shell Food Mart, which is a potential hazardous materials site. That was identified in the EA as well. So that's not anything new. We can come back to these maps if need be, but I did want to move forward to our matrix that we had prepared for this discussion here. So the matrix here it's broken up, I'd say, into two halves. The top half of this is more driven towards the ecological, but that'd be minus the additional right-of-way and additional relocations. So probably not the top half, but the middle third there. The National Wetland Inventories of stream floodplains, essential fish habitats, threatened and endangered species. That's all the real general ecological categories that are looked at as part of a NEPA process. But anyways, that's the I'd say top half of the matrix. And then generally the bottom half is what I would say is the social components. The values in the matrix are based purely on, like I said earlier, potential physical encroachment. That is where right-of-way is needed. What this shows when you're looking at it is there's not likely to be substantial increases in impacts to ecological resources. I think there's more of a focus on potential for impacts to the social community, especially when you're looking at alternatives 2 and 3. You can see a lot of darker colors here. As the colors get darker, it signifies more a higher level of impact. But again, overall, you're not really adding a whole lot to what the SCDOT had already identified as an impact as part of their recommended preferred alternative. Next part of the matrix, and I'll jump forward to our ranking and scoring on this. Again, it's taking what you saw quantity wise on the previous side and then just assigning it a rank based on how it stacked up against the other alternatives. but what the big takeaway from here is that alt 2 and 3 seem to have the most potential for additional impacts, contributing to their third and fourth place ranking, respectively. But again, this only takes into consideration the physical encroachments. Alternative 1, obviously with just minor right away there at Gumtree, doesn't have a lot of change, just not a lot of changes in impacts, which is why you're seeing a lot of low scores there, a lot of 1s and a couple 2s. The elevated bypass, alternative 4, has a fair number of 1s, and that's again mainly because of it occurring within existing right of way and not requiring any physical encroachments into neighborhoods or communities, but also has some higher values to a 2, a 3, and a 4. The 3 and the 4 are related to ecological resource, but again, overall, you're talking about less than an acre more than what was identified in the SCDOT preferred alternative. So it doesn't amount to a substantial amount more, but cultural resources is mainly because of the addition of the honeyhorn plantation into the mix. But you can see at the bottom there the rankings. Alternative 1, just because of the minimal changes to the environment or additional resources being added, that's why it ranked the highest from an environmental perspective. And then the bow ties came in at number 3, primarily because of the additional right of way, but also the bow ties would be bringing some traffic into those neighborhood areas that probably wouldn't be going that way if they were to stay on the main line. And then the Echelon Center turn overpass ranked the highest. Again, you're introducing some turning restrictions, some movement of traffic further into neighborhoods, but you're also introducing some elevated, some raised design features that create visual intrusions, barriers to the neighborhood. And then alternative 4, again, not physical encroachments, but there certainly are some neighborhood and environmental justice issues to consider here. But what we needed to do and how to take this a little bit further is to not only take into consideration the physical encroachment, but we needed to assess some weighted factors associated with these alternatives. Because, for instance, on alternative, you can see at rank, or I got a score of 1, but you are elevating a roadway through a community that's designated as an environmental justice population, but also a historic. It's not really a fair number, so we looked at it a little bit deeper and tried to assign some weight to it based on the risk to the cost and schedule. So let's move to the next slide there, Nate.
If I could ask a question real quick.
Sure.
The additional right-of-way impacts, number of acres, number of tracks, is that outside of what the town currently owns, or is that a combination of what the town owns and private property?
Lauren, do you have that?
Yes, that is additional right-of-way. The parcels that the town owns that isn't currently designated as roadway right-of-way is considered additional right-of-way.
Okay, thank you.
Just because we're not distinguishing who owns the property, just whether it is currently roadway right-of-way or not.
That'll be
That
important
is
for us.
the way the environmental process goes as well.
Yeah, for the environmental process, it's important to note that, even if the town owns it, I mean, this is an SCDOT project. So when they come through and purchase the right of way, there would still have to be some form of transfer of ownership between the town and the state. So I think play it conservatively.
Yeah, I understand that, but from a communal standpoint, we need to understand what it is and how it is affecting those residents in the area. And we're not as concerned about the town property as much as we are those within that Stony area. So that's an important information to have.
Yeah, and what we can do in the final report, we'll break that out separately. We'll have right-of-way that is privately owned and right-of-way that is owned by a public entity.
Okay, thank you. And also, if we could, if there are multiple tracks that are owned by the same people, if we could have that identified as well, just so that we know what impact we're talking about individually overall.
Sure. All right, any more questions before I move on? All right, Nate, please flip. Oh, you did. Sorry, I didn't even notice that. So when considering risk, not only do we take into consideration the additional impacts to resources, but how that alternative will affect cost and schedule due to the additional process that needs to be adhered to. The next series of slides, which is this starts that series, shows each alternative in relation to the current SCDOT recommended preferred alternative. So the first column there, I guess it's technically the second column, says baseline SCDOT.
Hey, Chad, just one
Yeah.
1 second. I did just want to take a moment and just reiterate what I said before. These are the additional slides that you all do not have in your presentation. So we will be providing the full deck of that. Sorry about that, Chad.
Oh, no worries. Thanks, Nate, for covering that. So the second column there is resource impacts that were pulled from the state's EA. The second column is the preliminary additional impacts from the considered alternative here. So in this case, on this slide, this is alternative 1. And then the fourth column there, total adjusted, is the base. It's the net change. So it's the baseline plus the alternative. And you can see here the ecological, the relocations, the right-of-way, they don't really present a major concern because there's just not a lot added compared to what SCDOT had identified in their EA. There is acknowledgement to the fact, and this is highlighted in the risk consideration column, to the need that there will be a need for additional field work, additional coordination with regulatory agencies. That will all need to happen. But in my opinion, it doesn't really present a game changer or a significant issue that couldn't be overcome. So, and you're going to see on each of the 4 alternatives here that we'll step through, that ecological relocation and right-of-way rows here are pretty much the same. So I'm not going to hash through those on every slide here, but what is important on these slides and what we will talk about more as part of each alternative is the neighborhoods, the environmental justice, the cultural resource, and the 4F aspects. So jumping right in here with alternative 1, the neighborhood environmental justice, the EA identified Stony community as an environmental justice area. It's obviously a neighborhood in of itself. We're not changing anything as part of, in terms of impact, not changing anything to Stony, but the addition of that 0.2 of an acre down at Squire Pope is a new neighborhood that's introduced because that's technically within the boundary of Squire Pope. And then, so that addition of 0.2 acres adds up to, takes you from 4.77 acres in the EA to about 5 acres if you were to move forward with alternative 1, at least in terms of neighborhoods and environmental justice. The new impacts to the Squire Pope community, again, well, it should require additional outreach and engagement opportunities to inform them of the updates to the project. Because right now I don't know how involved they've been in this project. It seems like Stony has been the primary one engaged. From environmental justice perspective, it's the same risk. Cultural resources, the EA identified 2 properties that were eligible for the National Register: the Stony Traditional Cultural Property, and then there's an archaeological site. And because of alternative 1, there's no change. The current Section 106 findings, so Section 106 is dealing with cultural resources, that being your above ground structures and subsurface features that are determined eligible or are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. But the current Section 106 finding was an adverse effect because of impacts of archaeological site. Because of alternative 1, I would see no need for additional change to that finding. We just need to add in what is changing as part of alternative 1, but it shouldn't have changed the overall finding. And then in terms of Section 4F resources, so I kind of defined what 4F resources were on the previous slide, but didn't really talk about it. But 4F resources deal with your cultural resources, so those resources that are eligible or listed for the National Register, but also public parks, trails, wildlife refuges, public recreational areas. These are all protected features under Section 4F. And so the EA evaluated, as they should, the 4F resources and how the project would impact it. Stony and the park at 152, William Hilton Parkway, those were found to have de minimis 4F impacts, which just means minor impacts that are just programmatically approved. The Pinckney Island National Wildlife Refuge, that had a net benefit programmatic 4F evaluation. Again, because of that, they had to do a detailed alternatives analysis. And I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this, but so I don't want to dwell on it too much, but had to look at a variety of alternatives to prove that the one that they picked had minimal impacts to the wildlife refuge. So net benefit for that property. And then let's see, I think that's it. Yeah, those 3. So as a result of alternative 1, I don't see any change expected to any of those 4F findings. You're not increasing any of the conversions of those resources. So the one added note I had here was whether the risk is Squire Pope. If it goes the same path as Stony did, it might have to be evaluated as a TCP itself. And even if it was considered a TCP, a traditional cultural property, and considered eligible for the register, the strip of right-of-way that Lauren is saying would be needed is really, if you look at it, it looks like it's part of the existing transportation infrastructure anyway, so it wouldn't be an actual conversion of a 4F resource from a non-transportation use to a transportation use. So I'm not really concerned about 4F for Squire Pope if it were even considered an eligible resource. So, all right, let's move forward to alternative 2. Alternative 2, again, we won't talk about the ecological relocations right away. It's not a lot of change there, just additional coordination. So this is the bow ties for neighborhoods and environmental justice. I believe there is should be some recognition of concern because of the location of the bow ties. And again, you're restricting turning movements at 278 and whatever crossroad there, whether it be Squire Pope or Spanish Wells. you're requiring traffic to go further into those neighborhoods to make basically a U-turn and come back around. That's introducing some probably undesirable transportation features into the neighborhoods themselves. So that's definitely something that needs to be considered, and more engagement with the communities and the public, just to get their input, their feedback on the change if alternative 2 was advanced. Excuse me. Cultural resources, again, with Stony and the archaeological site there. Addition of the bow ties requires just about an acre of additional right-of-way from Stony. I don't see that as necessarily constituting an adverse effect to that property. Now, I know the current finding is adverse effect, but that's only because of the archaeological site. Stony itself had a no adverse effect. So I'm also looking at it not from the overall Section 106 effect finding, but also by the property finding. So Stony had no adverse effect. Archaeological site 38, BU 66 had an adverse effect. The introduction of these bow ties and a little bit more of right away to basically taking almost 6 acres instead of almost 5 acres of right away from the Stony. I don't see it as a huge change that would make the Federal Highway Administration or the State Historic Preservation Officer think that would elevate to an adverse effect. Therefore, also in terms of 4F, although you are taking a little bit more in terms of right-of-way from the Stony, you're acquiring a little bit more from the Stony traditional cultural property. Again, 4F resource. It's not going to not going to require more consideration in terms of 4F. I mean, you'll still probably end up at a de minimis level, which is what it was as part of SCDOT's EA. Excuse me, I got something stuck in my throat. I apologize. Let's
Chad,
go to
Chad, if you
yeah.
don't mind too, as you're going through there, if you could maybe just focus on the net changes too, maybe that'll help just expedite things just a little bit.
Yeah.
Thank you, though.
Let's go to alternative 3 then. So alternative 3, in terms of net changes, then we do have 1.2 acres more from Stony and 0.2 acres new impact to Squire Pope. So these are additional impacts to the neighborhoods. Presents not only a neighborhood item of concern, but also an environmental justice concern as well. In terms of risk considerations, it's going to be the same as alternative 2 in terms of making sure the communities are engaged. I should add another factor in this, and I do note this here, is the factor adding echelon, so elevated position. So you're creating a visual obstruction in the neighborhood too, which could be an impact. And in this instance, this impact is also requiring additional right-of-way. So that additional right-of-way added on top of the elevated position of the echelons or the center turn lanes, center turn overpasses, that could create, in terms of cultural resources, could create the potential for elevating Stony from a no adverse effect to an adverse effect. That would require an amendment to the memorandum of agreement that the state and, that Federal Highway Administration and the State Historic Preservation Officer currently have executed. We'd have to amend it to incorporate some mitigation items to address adverse impacts to Stony. And then in terms of 4F resources, there is between Stony and the park at 152 William Hilton Parkway, there's about 6 acres of additional right-of-way, not additional right-of-way, but 6 acres of total right-of-way needed. And that added to an adverse effect as part of the cultural resources could give rise to the need for additional 4F evaluation. So basically, that means taking us from de minimis 4F impact to an individual 4F impact. So that just requires more time for coordination and alternatives evaluation. So that, again, that's why this alternative is ranking a little bit higher in terms of the social impacts. Let's go to 4 then, please, Nate. So 4 is very much like 3, except it doesn't require the additional right-of-way. Again, the elevated project elements within Stony creates that visual barrier that could be perceived as an adverse effect from a cultural resources standpoint, but it also serves as a dividing line between Stony itself, between the north half and the south half. So, you want to make sure, again, you engage with the public in the neighborhood there. I don't spend more time on alternative 4. Let's go ahead to the risk, weight, and mitigation here. So alternative 1 here, this is just assessing the risk based on cost and schedule. So how much is this going to have the potential to affect cost and schedule? Alternative 1 comes in at a fairly low ranking here, moderate for section 106 resource, just due to the additional archaeological that have to be completed and minor coordination. The 4F and the community and social impacts ranked very low. There's not a lot of potential for affecting cost and schedule. And I don't see any need for additional mitigation as part of alternative 1. The score there off to the side is 14. That comes from our initial matrix. And so the number next to the 14, just to give you some methodology to the logic here and how we arrived at the final weighting. So the 4 there is basically the column B1, B2, B3 added up. So 2 plus 1 plus 1 gave us 4. And then we multiplied 4 times 14, give us a final weighted rank of 56. The bow ties, because of that movement of traffic into the neighborhoods, the additional public outreach that would need to happen, that got basically a moderate. There's, in our opinion, it has a moderate potential affecting cost and schedule. So that gave it a total weighted rank of 144. And alternative 3, excuse me, let me cover mitigation here. Mitigation for alternative 2, unlikely for 106 4F, but community impacts could be required because of the introduction of the bow ties into the neighborhoods. Concepts could be the introduction of some traffic calming measures, inclusion of gullah art in the bow ties, or creation of unique gateways. These are all good opportunities that could be explored a little bit further here in our final deliverable. Alternative 3, the Echelon Center Turn Overpass. Because of the potential for high increase or high impacts to cultural resources in 4F, that ranked high just from the coordination and evaluation perspective, what would need to be undertaken. That ranked high for 106 4F and then moderate for community and social impacts, again, just because introduction of an elevated intersection into a currently at grade and mostly level intersection. So that gave it a risk adjustment of 8, final score of 264. And then the elevated bypass was ranked high across the board. Again, essentially drawing a barrier between in the Stony community creates a pretty high concern for community and social impacts. And then the elements we talked about for section 106 and 4F definitely have the potential to affect how the NEPA document is finalized. So that gave it a risk adjustment of 9 and a final score of 153. So the adjusted ranks for our alternatives from an environmental perspective were alternative 1 had the lowest score, or the highest if you want to, the best score. And then alternative 2 came in second. And then alternative 4, the elevated bypass, came in third. And then the echelon center turn overpass, alternative 3, came in with the most concerns from an environmental standpoint. So I know that's a lot to throw at you guys and kind of all over the place, but I'm happy to entertain any questions either now or even after the presentation.
Questions?
So I'll throw it to Kate here for wrap up.
Okay.
Question.
Thanks, Chad.
Charles did have a question, Kate. Sorry about that.
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
Was anything done about noise?
So noise is certainly a consideration, right? But at this high level review, it's not something that can be tuned in on, just because so much in the noise analysis varies on horizontal and vertical alignment. We're just not at that phase. And well, one, it's outside of the scope of what we're doing, but 2, you need to have a good horizontal and vertical profile laid out. And then we would have to have the state's noise model to take over and add these elements into that noise model and rerun it to determine whether there's additional impacts. We have looked at what was in the EA for noise. I don't see there being an appreciable change for noise here, but I can't say that with certainty without basically taking over the state's noise model and updating it for our stuff. But then in order to do that, I need to have elevations of the added elements, such as the bypass lane across Cross Island Parkway, to figure out what would be the noise change because of this added feature. So that is a great question. It is something that would need to be taken into consideration with whatever alternatives are advanced out of this process, this high level process. It's not something that was really factored as part of the high level review.
Okay, Kate, I think you can go ahead and take over.
Sure. If you go to the last slide, Nate, this is a total picture of all the different rankings, right? We started the conversation talking about traffic, moved through right-of-way, environment, safety, bike and pedestrian impact, community and social impact. We have a line for aesthetic, and then assumed cost relative to one another. And using a similar ranking system, kind of totaled everything up and then saw where the chips fell, and alternative 1 and 4 were tied when we consider all of these points equally. Again, Chad just explained that he did his environmental impact scoring with some slight weighting considerations. Other weighting factors really weren't incorporated into this overall table, again, because it's there are a lot of things that are important to a lot of different people, and we were trying to do our best to keep it as unbiased and equal opportunity, if you will, as possible for each of the alternatives. So this is how our analysis fell out. Alternative 1 and 4 essentially tie. You can see that across various categories they all score differently, but when you take a total picture of them at this high level, we don't see much overall impact or difference. Obviously, alternative 4 is going to have a higher cost and potentially a greater impact on the aesthetic, but then alternative 1 has different categories where it perhaps is less desirable than alternative 4. So our path forward from here, our intent is that this is the close of our analysis for task 3, as Nate was describing at the beginning of this presentation, and task 4 for our work involves picking one alternative to move forward into VISM analysis, which is further calibrating one of these alternatives. It really is going to, finish out the last 5 to 10% of confidence that we would like to have for one of these alternatives. Synchro is a great tool, but it, admittedly has some limitations, and those would all be clarified, and certainly all the I's dotted and T's crossed when we put this into a VISM model. So as our scope is written, we thought at the beginning of this process that there would be one clear winner to move forward into task 4 to put into a VISM model. Seeing now that we have 2 tied alternatives, Nate and I were talking before this meeting, and we certainly think that we could move both alternative 1 and alternative 4 forward into task 4 of our scope of work. That would just mean that we may not have as much flexibility to do multiple iterations of different configurations as some of the other intersections we have not yet considered, such as Indigo Run or Sea Pine Circle. However, based on our initial analysis of those locations, they don't seem to have as many congestion problems as this part of the corridor we've been focused on thus far, and we don't think that would be necessary, I guess, to have a high level of multiple iterative alternatives at those other locations. So that is, I guess, where I will leave it and open it up to questions, discussion, and then before we close the meeting out, we will want a determination on if we're moving forward with one alternative or 2 into task 4.
All right, questions, comments? Eddie? So I'm going to go back to the question I asked earlier, and that is about the impact to the land. It's tough to make a decision on 1, 2, 3, or 4 without knowing what the impact is on both the community and social impact and the acquisition of additional right-of-way. If it's town-owned land, if it's stony land, what is it? That's going to be a real big deciding factor as to which one I would recommend going forward. And there is a lot of information to disseminate from this. That's just some initial thoughts that I have.
As far as who owns what on the new right-of-ways, generally, and this mainly affects alternate 2 and 3, because alternate 1 and 4 obviously have very little or no new right-of-way. But generally, any of the new right-of-way along the Parkway is private land, and then on at Squire Pope, the north side is private, the south side is city-owned primarily, and then at Spanish Wells, it's mostly city-owned.
The problem with that comment is mostly not definitive. And that's where the question comes into play, because really what we're looking at here is what is the true impact for the residents in that area and what it means for mitigation. And then taking that at the same time and saying what is determined to be best for Stony and the best for the rest of Hilton Head all goes into that equation, trying to figure it out. So there's still some questions that have to be answered in my mind before I can make a decision on which alternative to this one.
We can certainly add that clarification in the report. We are going to step through all of this information thus far has been presented to this committee in presentation form, but we are going to document it into a report, as Nate mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. And I believe, as Lauren indicated during the discussion, we're happy to have that clarification explained in the report and documented in whichever way you would like to see it, so that you're able to make your decision. And if this group is not comfortable, moving forward in a certain direction at this time, you would rather wait and see the report, we are certainly happy to do so, and wait for you to have the chance to review that more detailed data before we move forward.
What I might need to know is a time frame, how that would adjust the time frame and everything else.
Lauren, how quickly could we delineate the town versus private?
We don't have the actual GIS data of the parcels. So what we're doing is looking at the online county map and estimating. So I can give you approximate numbers of what is city owned and what is private by the beginning of next week. By next Monday, we can have that. Possibly sooner.
Mayor,
I'll try to get it sooner, and if
we can certainly get this, and am I on here? Certainly get this and quantify the public versus private. Is there enough confidence to know that option 1 and 4, which Lockmuir has identified as sort of tied for the lead, is there enough information in this knowing that alternative 2 has 1.1 and alternative 3 has 1.4 acres of additional impact? And I want to point this out, because the town-owned property that's within the traditional cultural property designation, there's no distinction when it goes forward to federal highways, whether it's town or privately held. They'll be concerned about just additional impact with that entire designated area. Is there enough confidence to eliminate alternative 2 and 3, or do you need to have that specific?
Here's what I'm seeing is, we've got, based on the scores that are up here, we've got 19, 21, and 19, the three that are very close to each other. And the driving factor is that community and social impact, which is the land acquisition at a 4, but not knowing what that really is deprived of. It kind of tells me, okay, if it's mostly town-owned land, that's a different conversation than if it's Stony-owned land. So that's what's missing in that qualification of 4, because it's not taking into the real effects to the Stony community on the private ownership side. That's where I have a question.
I guess I have a question. As I've traveled the world, I've seen many bridges that are very, very aesthetic, pleasing, and and to rate that 4, I think if that had another rating, we'd suddenly look at option 4 as the clear cut. There would be. I would challenge you to go back and rethink that.
And I think where we're coming at from that aesthetic is kind of what we've heard from the group in previous meetings, that something elevated is not in line with the current community there. It's a change, and that's more of where it's an aesthetic impact. It's a change, not necessarily bad or good, but just different.
Maybe a change is what's needed to get rid of the gridlock that we saw a week ago.
And that gets into how much you weight each one of these categories. You know, maybe, yes, if you compare them, maybe it, 4 is worse aesthetically, potentially, but how much does that weigh compared to the operational benefits? And that's something that really, it's not, us doing the study, it's really, it's the community needs to make that decision, not us.
And there's
what
one,
they value more.
yeah, there's one other aspect that really goes into it. You're talking about the least expensive versus the most expensive, but we don't know what that percentage, delta is. And that in itself could be the kicker. So, does that move it to where 2 comes into play more? There's just a little dangling items that aren't being answered now to be able to really say which one, the true scoring effects are, in my mind.
In my mind, number 2 is, I think I would rather see 2 over number 1. Reasons. I think it's number 4 and number 2 is the way and everything I see, the way I rate it.
Other comments?
Yeah, can't we wait until we get that?
Yes. Mike.
Yeah, for me, I'd like to know the impact on timing. Because I know the committee previously, when asked about criteria and how to evaluate alternatives, one was minimize environmental impacts. And I think they've done a good job in looking at all of the items that go into environmental impact. There was consensus to try to minimize any additional property impacts, whether they were privately or publicly held. So I know that that's part of this evaluation. The hard part about the cost, because they would basically have to outline a detailed sort of project. We're looking at order of magnitude, but it would be nice to know if there is the cheapest option is X, it's X plus 10% or 20% to give an idea. We know that the current project as contemplated and recommended by the county is somewhere in the $425 million range. And so if that's option 1, then is option 2 for 500. So we can certainly look at that order of magnitude.
I think we have to.
So question to Lockmuller is what does that do to time frame? Because in order to get the downstream intersection and impacts, the goal was to lock in on an alternative for them to build into their VISIM model to begin that additional work.
So Lauren, you mentioned in regards to the right of way, that's something that we can go and we can delineate. I know that we don't have the GIS parcels, but being able to know which parcels are public versus private.
Yeah, we can approximate that and get that pretty quick.
Correct. And then we've requested the more updated unit costing, speaking to Sean's more updated estimate of $425 million. If we know that the current cost estimated for alternative 1 is $425, do you feel that we have enough that we can give that X plus a certain percentage to maybe expedite things?
I mean, we can take a shot at it, and I can use comparisons of just in general at grade pavement versus elevated,
right,
to get those differences. It'll be we'll be without local information. We'll be taking doing some approximations and things like that, but it should give what they're looking for.
Okay.
Can I ask the committee which specific criteria that you want the information? It sounds like obviously the right-of-way impacts, understanding of how that breakdown is both public and private, and then it sounds like cost, some evaluation of cost to know how to compare them rather than 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes.
on the other criteria, are you satisfied? Aesthetic is going to be, it's sort of a judgment, right? Would I like a elevated bypass in the middle of a community? Probably not, but I do understand that some bridges look nice, right? But, so I don't know how to give more information. That's a lot of personal opinion on that part of it, but cost and right-of-way impact.
Yes.
Anything else that would be,
Well,
they did the traffic operation, you know, the number of seconds and add or either you're adding to or cutting from any delay through that corridor.
I think the only other, as I mentioned earlier, is the pedestrian crossing, because that's where we've had over the years, many
Right.
injuries and whatnot. If they could take a swag at that, you know, what does a tunnel? Put a tunnel in when you're doing all the work out there. Difficult. Tunnel without doing any work, that becomes very costly.
Yeah, I guess my concern about a tunnel in this area is just the viability and being able to build one with the water table and everything. Not being an expert on construction in this area, I'm not sure that going under is really a viable option. Maybe it is.
Lauren, do you think it's fair to say that that could potentially require additional right-of-way to be able to fit that in?
It would definitely require additional right-of-way because either if you go up or under, because you've got to get back down to grade. And right now, all of the right-of-way is being used up by roadway. They're not providing additional right-of-way for that. So it would take some additional right-of-way. Now, would it be a lot? Probably not, but it would take some.
And based on the comments that were made during the presentation, I don't think that's a differentiating factor between alternatives, which is really what we're trying to lock in so we can model the downstream impacts and finalize this initial step. That could be a great recommendation at the end to say to consider grade separated bike and pedestrian facility.
Have you done pedestrian studies?
We spoke to the pedestrian, bike, and safety impact earlier on Kate's slides earlier in the presentation. If we wanted to go back to look at something specific, or we had a grading system for how we felt that each alternative, you know, the ones where, so the alternative one, it was more wide open. There wasn't any opportunities for refuge islands, whereas the alternatives 2, 3, and 4 provided that fewer conflict points and added to bike safety. We did speak to that earlier. We can go back to that if you'd like.
Coming in muffled to my ears.
Okay. I'm sorry. I thought you meant how we address the bike pedestrian impact and safety overall, but you're asking, did we have the actual pedestrian numbers?
Did you have that?
The data, Michelle and Kate, did we have with the traffic counts, was that in there, or do we just use conservative numbers with the synchro modeling?
When we did our analysis, we assumed we would be providing pedestrian access along the entirety of the corridor. The number of pedestrians did not change the type of facility that we provided. We assumed that any pedestrian there was important and needed equal access. So the number of pedestrians at a specific location, did not change our insistence on trying to provide as much protected access as possible at each of these alternatives.
But no counts were done. Is that it on pedestrians?
The traffic counts that we do them annually. We also did a couple of special counts. They're all vehicular movements, including bike and ped movements at every intersection. So, yes, sir, those were all provided to Lockmuir.
So one other thing on the community and social impact on alternative number 2, if, it's rated at a 4, then I understand we can go back and look at that, but if there's a way to decrease that number, what is it, what can be mitigated to make that less of an impact, which would improve the scoring on number 2. So I look at it and I go, what is there else that can be done to improve some of these numbers? And I see Mr. Boxley back there, and I'm sure he's got some thoughts running through his head as to what kind of mitigation with a bow tie could be done in these areas, to make them more feasible. Obviously, there's going to be more traffic, but where do we, and what do we do to make it better and to see if it's a better option? So.
I believe a driving factor of that score was more of the right-of-way that was going to be required, in addition to the additional turning movements going into the community. And Chad had, I believe on one of his slides, the mitigation measures that he foresaw as a potential for those.
I tell you what, why don't we not finish up on this right now, but I think it's a good opportunity to go to appearance by citizens, because we're having a lot of thoughts, and I'm certain that Jarl as well. So Lynn, you want to pull up the timer so we can go ahead and go to, are y'all okay with that? Go to appearance by citizens? Ready? Okay. Mr. Baer.
Thank you. I think you're actually on a good track. I want to remind you that you're not comparing apples with apples. Alternative 1 does not carry sufficient traffic because it stops at Spanish Wells Road, and it completely avoids critical connections, which you'll see in a moment, contribute to a lot of delay. I used Google Traffic, for example, to compare something like alternative 4, a bypass, to the situation today. I sent you copies of that. 14 minutes. Anything that is not alternative 1 and does have a good connection to the Cross Island and Local 278 in both directions will impact worker in and out traffic and save on the order of 14 minutes. And I'll show you my calculation, much more than the 330 seconds. So that should be one of the criteria that you use in differentiating between plans. Does it really save a significant amount of time? And show the calculations. Similarly, I've still don't understand the forecast numbers Lockmiller is using. They're not published anywhere. I attached some SCDOT curves showing we have 3,000 vehicles per hour one way today during our peak hours. And that's going to grow. We have various ideas for growth rates, but it's going to grow from 3,000 to 3,500 or 3,700 or maybe even 4,000. Your calculations for 2045 have to include that, and we want to see the calculations. There was another interesting, unexpected finding. I used Waze to try to get from the fire station on Cross Island Parkway to Moss Creek Light, and I'll show you that in the picture here. All of a sudden, the calculation showed that I took the back roads in Stony as the fastest way to get there. That was done, when you look at it, to avoid that westbound intersection at the merge between 278 and the Cross Island Parkway. That intersection is left out of SCDOT's calculations. It's not included in alternative 1. So alternative 1 gets a free ride when it shouldn't. It's much slower than is advertised. Next point. I'm glad you've reached the bypass conclusion. I think you need to include horizontal bypasses as well. I've got a 5-foot map here of the land involved, and almost all of it is town-owned, and a little bit is SCDOT-owned. So there's a lot of land in here to use. And for that which isn't, we ought to pay whatever is required to get it, because a horizontal bypass is very effective and could be beautiful. I attached in your summary here a picture of a bypass in Boston. It's beautiful. Get MKSK, who does a good job, to work on it, to make it the most beautiful, effective, efficient, stony, preserving bypass we can get. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baer. Any other public comments? Yes, sir.
Robinson, Indigo Run. A couple things. In answering what the concerns were of Alan, which are good, but they're, I think if you look at all the data that has been presented today by this consulting firm, let's just say that the majority, 95%, is city-owned. So what? Are you still going to go with one of the ones that something other than 4 or 1? If you find that out, in other words, what is the reason? It's nice to know, and I think you should know, but if it's going to hold stuff up, I don't think it's that important. I think in the hierarchy of the ranking, that is way down here in some regards. That's number one. Number two, I've heard a lot about this bow tie number 2 situation. As I've said in past meetings over the last couple of years, I urge whoever from the committee fly up to Indianapolis, find out what they did on 96th Street, on Keystone Boulevard, on Route 37 from Fishers to Noblesville. Big, big roads. And prior to finishing that, they did try what you call the bow tie. They called it was some other deal that actually originated in Michigan. The biggest failure publicly that they ever did, okay, where you go straight and you have to turn around to turn left. The thing that I'm seeing here is, though, up there, even 2 things. One, most people didn't know that's what you're supposed to do. That's number one. So constantly people were turning left anyway against the law. That's number one. Number 2, people who from out of town absolutely didn't know anything about it. But most importantly, this bow tie, as you call it, you're talking about roundabouts. Indy doesn't have roundabouts. You go straight, and the road goes straight, and you have a turn lane, a lane. You're only going to put a lane in, and you have a light there. And as soon as it has cars, it'll turn. And they're going to turn around and come back. Okay? You don't need a roundabout. You just need a turn lane on Gumtree Road and a turn lane on the other road. You don't need roundabouts. So that's going to be cost effective, less property involved, and you're going to accomplish the same thing. So that's what I just wanted you folks to understand. You don't need roundabouts on that bow tie, just turn lanes.
Okay. Thank you. Great.
I'm actually going to cover the points that I superseded myself responding to Lockmuller's statistics last time. So, starting with point 2. I attended a town meeting at the Hilton Head Library several weeks ago. It was extremely evident that the majority of the Gullah Geechee community who reside in the Stony and other native island areas do not want all of this construction, not only on 278, but also on the side roads such as Squire Pope and Spanish Wells and Wild Horse that is being proposed as a part of this huge project. As a way of minimizing the construction on these existing roads, I would urge you to continue to pursue the concept of a bypass, which we did today, whether horizontal as proposed by Mr. Baer or elevated as proposed by the consultant. In recent conversations with Gullah residents, it became apparent that the environmental assessment contains numerous inaccuracies, particularly in the statements that were taken from Gullah residents who were not even made aware that they were being interviewed for inclusion in the environmental assessment. So that's something that is going to be challenged by Gullah residents. Number 3, the majority of the Hilton Head residents are clearly not in favor of an 11-lane, 130-foot wide super slab as being the entrance to our beautiful island and covering up a significant portion of Pinckney Island, our adjacent National Wildlife Refuge. I doubt that a project of this magnitude will even withstand proper environmental scrutiny, and we are pursuing that issue. Several years ago, Senator Tom Davis, as you may recall, stated to the Hilton Head Town Council that Then SCDOT Director Christy Hall said that this is a Hilton Head project and that if the residents of Hilton Head don't want it, it will not be built. It does not appear that the voices of Hilton Head residents are being heard, whether that be the members of the Gullah community or other residents. Please do so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other comments from the public? Anyone else? Oxley?
Good afternoon, committee. Thomas Boxley, Executive Director of the Gullah Geechee Historic Neighborhoods Community Development Corporation. We've heard a lot of information today. I would urge the committee to definitely err towards the side of not acquiring more property from property owners in the Stony community. This is something that is a reoccurring statement that I hear in the conversations that I'm having with community members. Also, I see safety. Safety is also as a major component of this particular project that needs to be considered at a very high level. As we know, we've had a couple of safety issues in the last couple of weeks, and we were in a meeting earlier talking about just the need for crosswalks and other means by which pedestrians and bikers can actually safely cross the roadway there. So I know this is not an easy decision. Matter of fact, it's pretty difficult. But I will urge you to be sure and consider the residents in the Stony community that have given up so much in the past as we move forward with this project. So thank you.
Thank you. One last call. Any other comments? Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, everybody. I was sitting and listening, and as I hear all about the bypass, I was really happy to hear about that and to focus on that, because that gives us an alternative rather than coming just, taking our heritage on Stony. Because I feel once you open the door one time, there might be other doors after that. When they see one door swing so easily, then that gives you the idea, we can probably do that elsewhere as well. So I'm grateful that you're listening, and not only listen, but do something about it, okay? And if you can take another route to make all this happen, then please do, okay? I'm reminded about something, and y'all can read this when you get home. This is 1 Kings chapter 21, where the king Ahab wanted Naboth's land because it was right next to him, next to his palace. And when he consulted him about the land, he asked him for it, to give him his land. And then he said no, so then he wanted to swap with him. And then he said, no, well, then I'll buy it from you. But anyway, the man didn't want to do either because the land was so precious to him, because the land was his heritage from his ancestors, so it meant a lot to him. And of course, the king Ahab was so sad that he didn't get what he wanted. He was spoiled. He used to get everything he wanted. So then he went home sad, so sad he wasn't eating. And then when his wife Jezebel, when she got home, she wanted to know what's wrong. And he told her what was wrong. So she told him, well, you signed a letter that I'm going to write, and I'm going to get it for you. So she had the man killed for his land, okay? Then God sent his prophet to tell Ahab, because you did what you did, the dogs are going to lick your blood, and the dog is going to eat your wife, okay? Because he did wrong, and he didn't listen because God didn't want him. So my quest to the mayor and this committee is, please listen to our people. We only have what God blesses us with, and our ancestors look out for us long before we even got here. They bought land to make sure that we had a place to live here on Hilton Head Island. So we were blessed with this land. We sharing it with everybody. So let us all come and enjoy it, and don't over advertise. Why are we advertising so much when we only know Hilton Head is but so big? We still inviting people to come. So when are we going to get enough? And I hope and pray that we will listen to what the people who are hurting got to say, and we can all enjoy this land in the future. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. All right, any other public comment? All right, so we'll bring it back for some direction. I think that we all agree that we need a little bit of additional information before we determine which VISMs to run. Would y'all agree with that? Okay. So the sooner you can have that back to us, and if we can, not necessarily need to set up a meeting, but if we could reach out and get an opinion, I think that would be helpful. Not to try to hide anything from the public or anything like that, but we're just trying to move along. Maybe just a quick poll right off the bat. Which two would you like to see? No, I'm talking about of the current model. Yeah, of the current, 4 alternatives.
Or number 4, yes, of all the alternatives.
Also number 4 and number 2.
Yeah, so I'm leaning towards a 2 and a 4, or a modification of 2, is what I'm leaning towards.
Number 2, I have to agree with the gentleman who spoke. What we're doing is putting in traffic circles, which take up room, they cause confusion, traffic flow. It's they're not the way to go, in my opinion. So that's one thing that I've eliminated number 2.
Yeah, but I need additional information. I'm just putting that out there so it's public knowledge.
Yeah, and we can do, again, the right of way pretty quickly. I've done it, scratched up, looking at the map, and it's mostly town property, but I do think we owe it to you, the exact acreage.
So when you were looking at number 2, did you also look at many states, New Jersey, they have, the J or the hook? So you go by and make a right-hand turn instead of the left turns? Is that, instead of going all the way down the street and coming back, to look at that?
That was definitely one that was included in previous submittals, and in December, we had a meeting with you all, just receiving direction from you. Definitely independent analysis, but seeking maybe from a hierarchy standpoint, what was more palatable versus not as much, and the non-standard left turns. I know it could be perceived as the bow tie as being a non-standard left turn, but the J turn, as you said, or jug handles, or the median left turns, there was a strong opposition in the committee meeting to where there wasn't any desire for us to move forward with that. So that's why that was not included.
And
I had a slightly different understanding of what he was asking about. Were you asking about you actually like veer off as a right turn and kind of curl around, and then you're going back straight?
Yeah, you go by the intersection, and you make a right hand, or it's before the intersection. Either way, it's either before or after. You make a right turn, and you come back into traffic that's crossing over. You just have to merge into the traffic, and you're not going quarter mile down some side street to make a turn and come back. It's real quick and simple.
Yeah, so like a traditional Clover interchange, kind of, if you see, but like how most interchanges are throughout the United States, kind of doing that movement. And that was certainly something that we considered, but that footprint is like the addition of that roadway in a quadrant to make the turn, as you're suggesting. We wouldn't have been able to use any of the existing roadway alignment. It would have required a lot more right of way. And so because of those reasons, we decided not to move that forward as one of our alternatives for consideration, because we could generally achieve the same thing with the bow tie, and the bow tie largely stayed within existing roadway footprints.
Thank you. New business? Anybody have any new business? So May 8th is our next meeting. If we waited until May 8th to make this decision as to which VISM to run, what does that do to a timeline? If you could provide that information. I know you need to run some scenarios, but that'll help in determining the pace at which we move. Can we look at that, Sean?
We can certainly look at it, but I do want to hear from Lockmuller. So we had a meeting last week to talk about being in a position for what we call the expanded study area. And I do want to point out alternative one as identified here is not the SCDOT or county Moss Creek to right before the Spanish Wells intersection. It is Moss Creek all the way through the Gumtree intersection. That's what Lockmuller has been evaluating when they talk about this modified alternative one. That's what it's been from the beginning. So it does include, and if you look at what they presented, it included some recommendations at the Gumtree intersection. But in order to move forward to get these findings that we need for this area, and then the downstream findings, we were looking for a decision on an alternative today. Delaying the ability to do the VISM, it's pretty intense of a operation to do it and get the evaluation. So I'll leave it up to them to let you know the overall impact on schedule. But the plan was to bring a final report to the committee in June so that we could move things forward. But
I think maybe one way we can move forward. It seemed to be there was a consensus on wanting to understand or having a VISTA model associated with alternative 4. That's my understanding. Perhaps we could move forward with alternative 4 and then provide you the right-of-way information for number 2, so that way we continue moving forward and then get you that information with regards to cost and then right-of-way.
Sean, what's your thought on that?
One, I want to get you the information and make a decision on the alternative as soon as possible. Alternative 4 is a significant deviation over what has currently been proposed, been evaluated, been vetted, been shared publicly. And so I'm not positive yet on the timeframe implications.
And the one reason why I want to know what the cost variance is, if we're at $420 million and it adds another $100 million, I'm just using numbers, that might persuade me away from it. And I'll state this, I have a problem with the flyover side. Just from an aesthetics, environmental side, I have a problem with that. But I'm trying to balance everything as between moving traffic, safety, but also keeping the character of our island. That's very important that we do that. So I don't want to spend money on running VISM on option 4 if it is totally not feasible, but I also don't want to run it on something that isn't providing the right solution. So.
And I understand, and I don't want to also run the risk that if there's a project that has similar benefits, and our local position is 150% the cost, that the response is, well, the town, the delta, yeah. Mayor, to move things forward, I always hate to ask for an additional meeting, but I think if we can have this information, get it as soon as possible.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not even thinking as soon as we have it, I'll work with Nate and my team to get it, and
Okay.
then work with you to schedule a meeting.
Let's do that.
Yep.
Let's do that because I like the idea of putting it on the table in front of everybody. So let's do that. Okay. All right, so you'll get back with us on that, so thank you. Thank you all for another great presentation. Lynn, I did not ask if there were any comments submitted through the portal.
No portal comments made.
Okay, thank you. Good? All right, we're adjourned. Thank you all.